David was never the type of man to chase after foreigners or dream of marrying into wealth. He was a 30-year-old Nigerian man with calloused hands, a quiet spirit, and eyes that carried both hope and struggle. Every day he worked at a hotel in Victoria Island, not as a manager, not as a front desk agent, but as a private tour assistant for the hotel's high-paying foreign guests. He didn't mind. The job gave him just enough to feed himself, send money back home, and dream of one day owning a small business. He had no idea that on one humid Thursday morning, everything about his life was going to change. Vivian walked into the hotel lobby like she owned the entire block. She had grace, money, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had lived a full life. At 50, she wasn't flashy, but there was something elegant about the way she carried herself. She was in Lagos for a charity gala her late husband once supported, and she'd requested a private tour of the city. David, in his clean white shirt and modest smile, was assigned to her. He thought she'd be another rude foreigner who asked strange questions and complained about the heat. But from the moment she spoke softly, warmly, and with genuine curiosity, David was intrigued. She asked about the people, not just the sights. She listened when he spoke. And when he made her laugh, she didn't hide it like most of the wealthy women he'd met. That day turned into more days. What started as a one-day tour extended into a full weekend of exploring hidden places in Lagos most foreigners never saw. David took her to Lekki Market, the beach at Tarkwa Bay, and even to a small jollof spot where they shared food from the same plate. Vivian was unlike any woman he'd ever met. She didn't care about appearances, didn't treat him like help, and didn't flinch when their hands accidentally touched. David noticed things: the way her eyes softened when she talked about losing her husband, the way she smiled when he offered her his umbrella in the rain. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something he had buried deep: affection. By the time her 2-week trip was over, they had exchanged more than smiles. Vivian sat across from him in the hotel lounge the night before her flight and said the words David never expected to hear. "I don't know what this is, but I know it's real. Come visit me in America." He stared at her, heart pounding. Was this woman serious? Was it a joke? But her eyes didn't blink. She meant it. And something inside him, something he couldn't explain, told him to take the chance. What neither of them knew was that this decision would lead to the deepest love story of their lives and the greatest storm they would ever face. David had never left Nigeria before. The idea of flying to America felt like something out of a movie. But a few weeks after Vivian returned to the States, she made good on her promise. A plane ticket, visa sponsorship letter, and a short message arrived in his email. "I haven't stopped thinking about you. Come." It took David days to process it. Friends warned him to be careful. Some thought it was a scam, while others believed Vivian was just bored and using him for attention. But deep down, David trusted her. The way she had looked at him, listened to him, cared about his dreams, none of it felt fake. When he finally stood in the immigration line at JFK Air, with a small bag and big nerves, he prayed quietly. "God, please don't let me be wrong about her." Vivian was waiting outside, bundled in a grey coat, her blonde hair pulled back. The hug she gave him was long and warm, as if they had been apart for years. She drove him straight to her home in Connecticut, a massive white colonial house with tall windows, art on the walls, and a long driveway he couldn't even walk the length of without resting. David had never seen a house like it in real life. It was beautiful, but intimidating. He felt like he didn't belong there. But Vivian made it feel like home. They spent weeks learning each other all over again. David cooked jollof rice in her kitchen, introduced her to Afrobeat music, and made her laugh with stories from his childhood. Vivian showed him how to use the dishwasher, took him to jazz concerts, and even signed him up for a short business course. They didn't rush anything. But love, real love, doesn't need much time. 6 months later, they got married in a quiet ceremony at a courthouse, just the two of them, no family present. It wasn't because they didn't want guests. It was because Vivian hadn't told her family about David. She had her reasons. Her adult children were already cold and dismissive. Her younger sister was known for her judgmental comments. And her older brother, a retired military officer, was outspoken about his dislike for outsiders. Vivian couldn't bear the idea of them mocking David or seeing him as a threat. So she kept their marriage private just until she could find the right moment. But as the months turned into years, that moment never came. And now, with David lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life, that secret was about to explode. It started as a small cough. David thought it was just a cold or maybe the changing weather. He still wasn't used to the icy chill of American winters, but as days passed, the cough worsened. He grew tired more often, lost his appetite, and began waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. Vivian noticed the changes, but David brushed them off. "It's nothing serious," he would say with a tired smile. But deep down he knew something wasn't right. Vivian insisted on taking him to the hospital. After a series of scans and blood tests, the diagnosis hit them like a brick wall: an aggressive illness, one that had been silently growing inside him for months. The doctors said they had caught it late. Treatment was an option, but there were no guarantees. Vivian sat quietly in the consultation room, her hand clutched tightly in David's, eyes filled with disbelief. She whispered, "Why you? After everything we've been through." They started treatment immediately. Vivian stayed by his side every day. She cooked his meals, held his hand through the pain, and wiped his brow when the fever hit. But despite all her efforts, David's body grew weaker. He lost weight rapidly, and his once strong voice became a whisper. The hospital became their second home. Nurses came to know them as the quiet couple in room 312, the older white lady and her young black husband who barely spoke. One rainy afternoon, after a painful round of treatment, David turned to Vivian and said, "I think it's time. Tell them." Vivian looked at him, eyes wide. She knew what he meant: her family. For years she had hidden David from them, too afraid of their rejection and judgment. But now, lying here, knowing that time was running out, David didn't want to die as a secret. He deserved to be seen. He deserved to be known. With trembling hands, Vivian picked up her phone and began making the calls she had avoided for years. She didn't know how they would react. She didn't even know if they would show up. But for David, she had to try. And what came next would test the limits of love, loyalty and truth. Vivian's hands shook as she dialed each number. One by one, she reached out to the people she had carefully kept David hidden from for years: her son, her daughter, her brother, and her younger sister. Some calls went unanswered. Others ended with awkward silence after she said his name. But by the following evening they began to arrive. The first to walk through the hospital door was her daughter, Emily, tall, sharp-featured, and as cold as ice. Her eyes scanned David's frail body lying in the hospital bed, then flicked toward her mother. "Is this a joke?" she muttered under her breath. Vivian didn't respond. She simply squeezed David's hand and stayed seated beside him. Soon after, Greg, Vivian's grown son, entered. He was dressed in a pressed shirt, his jaw tight, eyes filled with confusion and quiet anger. "Mom, what is this? Why is there a man here? You said it was an emergency." Vivian stood, voice calm but firm. "This is David. He's my husband." The room fell silent. You could hear the soft beeping of the hospital machines. David, too weak to speak, watched the family with tired eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even nervous. He was just sad. Sad that after all these years of love, this was how he was meeting them, like a secret exposed under pressure. More relatives arrived over the next hour. Her younger sister, Karen, barely hid her disgust. "You married a Nigerian man? And didn't even tell us?" Vivian stood firm. "Yes, because I knew you'd react just like this." But she wasn't alone. David's younger brother Chuka and his cousin Tolu, both of whom had come to visit him from Nigeria 2 weeks ago, stood silently at the back of the room. They watched the scene unfold, both out of place in the crowd of well-dressed white strangers. Yet they stood tall, representing the side of David's life that had always embraced him. The hospital room, once quiet, was now filled with tension. Stares clashed, emotions simmered, but no one dared to raise their voice in front of the dying man. Vivian pulled her chair closer to David and held his hand tighter, as if shielding him from their judgment. She whispered, "Don't let their presence make you forget who you are to me." What none of them expected was that David still had the strength to speak, and what he would say next would silence the entire room. The hospital room was still. The murmurs had faded. Every pair of eyes, hostile, confused, ashamed, were now resting on David. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath heavier than the last. Vivian wiped a tear from the corner of his eye, and for a moment no one else in the room mattered to her. But David, with a quiet strength he hadn't shown in days, blinked and moved his dry lips. "Water," he whispered. Vivian gently lifted a cup to his mouth. As he sipped, his eyes moved across the room. He saw the faces of people who had never known him, yet had already judged him. He looked at Emily, who had folded her arms, her expression blank. He looked at Greg, who still hadn't sat down. And then his gaze landed on Chuka and Talu, the only two who had crossed oceans to stand beside him. That was when he slowly tried to sit up, and though it took effort, Vivian helped him lean against the pillows. "I know most of you don't know me," David said, voice raspy but steady. "And that's not your fault. It's because your mother, my wife, was afraid of what you'd think of me." A few glances shifted uncomfortably, but David continued. "But what you don't know is that I never wanted to be hidden. I just wanted to love her the way no one else could." Vivian squeezed his hand tightly, fighting tears. David looked around again. "When I met Vivian, I didn't see her money or her skin color. I saw heart. I saw a woman who cried when a child begged on the street, who laughed like she hadn't been broken before, who treated me with more respect than most people back home." He paused to catch his breath, and the silence in the room was deafening. Even Karen looked slightly shaken. "I may not have lived in a big house, and I may not have your fancy last names, but I gave your mother joy. Real joy. I never took $1 from her. I gave her peace." Tears were running down Vivian's cheeks now. She had waited years for her family to see David not as a mistake, but as the man who made her life whole. Then David turned to Emily and Greg. "You don't have to love me, but before I leave this world I need you to know this. I never stole your mother. I gave her back to herself." The room was silent. For once, no one had anything to say. But that wasn't the end. Because David's next words would reveal something even deeper, something that would change how everyone remembered him forever. David's breathing slowed again, and for a moment, Vivian feared he had said all he could. She leaned in close, her hand gently cupping his cheek. But then his lips parted once more, and his gaze turned back to the uneasy crowd in the room. "There's something else I need to say," he whispered. His voice was thin but clear, cutting through the silence. "I'm not just the man your mother married. I'm also the reason she's still alive." A few heads turned sharply. Vivian looked confused. Emily narrowed her eyes. David took a deep breath and continued. 3 years ago, Vivian collapsed in Lagos. Heart issue. You didn't know because she didn't tell you. I was the one who rushed her to the hospital. I stayed with her through surgery. I was there when she woke up. That was when I realized love isn't about what people think. It's about who shows up when no one else does. Vivian's eyes widened. She hadn't expected him to bring that up. She had chosen not to tell her family how close she came to dying, or who saved her. "You think I was some poor African man chasing her money?" David's voice grew firmer, even though it strained him. "But the truth is, I gave her a second chance at life, and all I wanted was to live the rest of that life beside her." Emily's face softened just slightly. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Karen looked at the floor. "I've never asked her for money," David added. "I built a small online business with what I had. She never paid for my dignity. I brought that with me. Tolu stepped forward and placed a hand on his cousin's shoulder. Vivian reached for a tissue, her eyes red and puffy. For the first time, the walls between David and her family began to crack. He wasn't just a secret. He was a man who had given Vivian the kind of love no money could buy, and now, on his deathbed, he was giving her family a truth they could never ignore. But he wasn't finished. There was still one last thing he had to say before the end came. David's voice trembled now, as though even speaking was beginning to drain what little strength he had left. Vivian leaned closer, her heart pounding, as his fingers weakly motioned toward the drawer by his bedside. "There's a letter," he whispered, barely audible. Vivian opened the drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with careful handwriting on it. On the front, it read, "To those who think they know me." Vivian hesitated. "You want me to read it?" David gave a faint nod. So she opened the envelope with shaky hands and began reading aloud to the room full of strangers who still hadn't accepted the man she loved. "I never had the privilege of sitting at your dinner tables or being invited to family holidays. I was never given a chance to know your names, your laughter, your struggles. But I knew your mother. I knew the sound of her joy, the weight of her pain, and the depth of her loneliness before I arrived. You may never understand why she chose me, but I'll tell you this. I never once tried to become someone else to win her heart. I was simply myself, and she loved me anyway. So if you walk out of this room still believing I don't belong, that's fine. But remember, I didn't ask to be accepted, I only asked to be respected. And when I close my eyes for the last time, I won't be thinking of your judgment. I'll be thinking of her." Vivian's voice cracked by the time she reached the end of the letter. No one spoke. Not even Karen. David closed his eyes gently, as if even he needed a moment to breathe after hearing his own truth spoken aloud. His chest rose and fell slowly. In that still room, full of people who once believed they knew what love looked like, David had done the unthinkable. He had made them question everything. And he wasn't done yet. Because in the final days ahead, someone in that room would have a change of heart, and it wouldn't be who anyone expected. After the letter was read, the air in the hospital room felt heavier, but not in the way it had before. The silence was no longer full of judgment. Now it felt like quiet reflection. For the first time, some eyes looked away, not out of disgust, but out of guilt. Vivian placed the letter gently on the nightstand, then returned to David's side, brushing his damp forehead with the back of her hand. Then, to everyone's surprise, it was Greg, Vivian's son, who finally broke the silence. He cleared his throat and spoke quietly. "I didn't know about the heart attack, or about the business." He looked at his mother, then at David. "I thought this was just some reckless thing you did after Dad died. I didn't know he actually saved your life." Vivian nodded, her voice soft but firm. "He didn't just save my life, Greg. He reminded me what it meant to feel alive." Greg walked over slowly and sat on the edge of the hospital window ledge. He didn't say much else, but his body language had shifted. His arms weren't crossed anymore. He was no longer glaring. Instead, he looked down at the floor, quietly thinking. Emily, on the other hand, still held onto her wall. She stayed near the door, her jaw clenched, arms folded like a shield. Karen whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes kept darting between David and the letter, as if she couldn't decide what to believe. Chuka and Tolu exchanged glances but remained quiet. They had expected nothing from Vivian's family, yet watching Greg begin to thaw gave them a small glimmer of hope. Maybe David's words were working. Maybe this family wasn't completely unreachable. Then David stirred again. His breathing had grown shallow, but his hand reached out gently. He pointed toward Greg and motioned for him to come closer. Greg hesitated, but then stood and walked toward the bed. David opened his eyes slowly. "Thank you for listening," he said weakly. Greg nodded. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm sorry I judged you." It was a beginning. Not full forgiveness, not overnight transformation, but a beginning. And in the days that followed, more truths would be uncovered, because David had more to say, and not all of it was about love. Vivian had barely slept. She stayed by David's side through the night, dozing off in short bursts while holding his hand. The nurse came in quietly every few hours to check his vitals. The doctors said he was stable, but weak. Every breath felt borrowed, and every hour, she knew, could be his last. That morning, as sunlight crept through the blinds, Vivian found herself staring at the letter David had written. But her eyes weren't fixed on the words, they were fixed on a folded slip of paper tucked beneath it. She hadn't seen it before. Slowly, she opened it. Her hands trembled as she read the contents. It was a bank statement not from her own account, but from a U.S.-based small business account registered in David's name. It listed deposits, online sales, and even charity transfers. At the bottom was a handwritten note. For the youth centre you wanted to build, you always dreamed it. I just made it possible. Vivian gasped softly, tears springing to her eyes. This wasn't just a side hustle. David had been saving quietly from his business to fund a dream she once shared with him, a local centre for underprivileged kids in Nigeria. She had talked about it once, long ago, thinking it was just wishful thinking. David had taken it seriously. She handed the paper to Greg. His brows furrowed as he read it, and he looked up in disbelief. He saved $50,000? Vivian nodded. From online exports, he sold African-made goods. He built the business from scratch. Emily, still by the door, finally stepped closer. You mean to tell me he wasn't living off you? Vivian turned to her daughter, tears streaming down her face. No, Emily, he was pouring into me, in ways no one else ever has. The room fell quiet again, but this time, it wasn't a silence of tension. It was the kind that came with realization. Slowly, assumptions were cracking. Greg looked at David and whispered, You didn't just love her. You honored her. And still, even with all that revealed, David had one more thing left, something that none of them saw coming. Because the final chapter of his life wasn't going to end in silence. It was going to end with legacy. Later that afternoon, while David drifted in and out of sleep, the nurse returned with a suggestion. If there's anything he wants to say, now would be a good time to record it. Vivian's heart clenched. She wasn't ready to hear those words, not out loud, but deep down she knew the nurse was right. They had no idea how many days or even hours David had left. She picked up his phone, an old, slightly cracked Android he always refused to replace. Vivian knew his password by heart. As she opened the video recorder, something stopped her. She noticed a saved draft of video David had already recorded. The thumbnail showed him sitting up in a chair, filmed weeks earlier, likely during one of the few days he had felt strong enough to move. She clicked play. David appeared on the screen, smiling faintly. His voice was steadier, though tired. If you're watching this, then I probably didn't make it. Don't be sad. Really, I lived a full life the day I met Vivian, and I want the world, especially her family, to know a few things. Vivian's hands flew to her mouth as she gasped. Everyone in the room turned. Greg reached over and gently took the phone, holding it up so the rest of the family could see and hear it. David's voice continued. To Greg, Emily, Karen, you don't know me, and maybe you never wanted to. But I loved your mother with everything I had. And if you ever wondered what she saw in me, it was kindness, loyalty, and honesty. Not money, not pity, just love. And to the two people who came all the way from Nigeria, Chuka, Tolu, you're more than family. You're my witnesses that true love knows no border. Then David's eyes in the video softened. He looked down and whispered. To Vivian, thank you for risking your world for me. I didn't deserve a love like yours, but I'm grateful you gave it anyway. Tears ran down Vivian's face like a flood. Emily looked away, blinking rapidly. Karen stood stunned, speechless. The man they thought they knew was nothing like the man speaking from the screen. David, in his final days, had given them a gift. His truth raw, direct, and without apology. And by the time the video ended, none of them would ever see him the same again. The room remained still for several moments after the video ended. No one said a word. It was as though David's voice had cut through every layer of pride, doubt, and prejudice in that hospital room. Greg quietly handed the phone back to Vivian, who held it to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her heart from breaking. Then, unexpectedly, Emily, the one who had stayed furthest from David all day, took a small step forward. Her eyes were red now, but she wasn't crying. Not exactly. She just looked lost, as if something inside her had finally cracked. "I judged him," she said quietly. "From the moment I walked in, from the moment I heard his name. I didn't even give him a chance." Vivian looked up at her daughter, startled but silent. Emily continued. "I thought he was just another man trying to use you. I didn't even ask who he was. I assumed I knew. And I didn't want to understand." She stepped closer to the bed now, looking at David's fragile body. "But he recorded a message for all of us, even for me." Greg nodded gently. Karen looked down at her hands, unable to make eye contact. For once, no one interrupted Emily as she slowly reached out and touched David's hand just for a moment. It was a small gesture, but powerful. "I may not have accepted him in time," she whispered, "but I'll honor him now." Vivian's eyes welled with tears again. She never expected to hear those words from her daughter. Not after years of silence and distance, but real love had a strange way of softening even the hardest hearts. Then Emily turned to Vivian. "If he wants the youth centre built, we'll do it. I'll help. Greg will too." Greg gave a quiet nod in agreement. For the first time, Vivian felt like David's legacy would not end with his last breath. It would live on in people who were just beginning to see who he truly was. And though the hour was drawing closer, David had one more unexpected visitor, someone no one had told about him. Someone who was about to walk in and change everything again. The door to the hospital room creaked open slowly, drawing the attention of everyone inside. Vivian turned, expecting perhaps another nurse or one of the hospital staff, but the moment her eyes landed on the figure at the door, her entire body froze. Standing there was Howard, her older brother. Retired military man. Fiercely opinionated, cold, controlling, and painfully traditional. The one person Vivian had purposely not called. He hadn't spoken to her in nearly a year after she declined to attend a high society fundraising dinner with him. Vivian had told herself it wasn't worth the drama. But somehow he was here. Someone must have told him. He walked in, crisp in his khaki coat, silver hair combed back, and eyes scanning the room like a general inspecting a battlefield. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Even Emily tensed. Karen stood and greeted him with a polite nod, while Greg stayed quiet. Howard's gaze landed on David and stayed there. He raised a brow slightly. "So this is the man," he muttered. Vivian stood protectively beside David. "Howard, don't start. Please." But Howard didn't speak. Not yet. He walked slowly to the foot of the bed and looked David over with a stoic face. Then, after an uncomfortable pause, he said something no one expected. "He looks peaceful." Vivian blinked, unsure what he meant. Howard continued, this time looking around the room. "I was angry when I heard. Not because of his age or race, but because you didn't tell us. You didn't give us a chance to meet the man you gave your life to." Vivian shook her head. "Would you have accepted him, Howard? Be honest." Howard sighed and looked down. "Probably not. Not at first, but that was my problem, not his." Then he turned to David and gently adjusted the corner of his blanket. "If he brought you peace, Viv, then he did more for you than any of us ever did." The room went silent again. Greg looked stunned. Emily looked away. Karen had tears in her eyes. Vivian stood frozen, unsure of how to process her brother's words. But deep in her soul, she knew David's life was changing people, even now, even in his weakness, even in the face of death. And what happened next, just after Howard sat down beside his sister, would be something none of them ever forgot. For a few minutes the room was quiet again, but this time It was a peaceful kind of silence. The air no longer felt tight with judgment or distance. Vivian sat beside David, gently brushing his hair away from his damp forehead. Her brother Howard now stood quietly at the window, arms folded, eyes thoughtful. Greg and Emily had pulled up chairs and sat close to the bed. Even Karen was now standing by the table, holding a tissue. Then Talu, David's cousin, stepped forward. In our culture, he began softly. When someone is about to pass on, we don't just cry. We pray. We speak peace into the journey ahead. Vivian nodded tearfully. She had seen this once before during her visit to Lagos, and something about it had always stayed with her. "Would that be okay?" Talu asked, looking around the room. No one objected. In fact, Howard surprised everyone when he spoke up first. "Yes, let's do that." Talu and Chuka moved to David's side and placed their hands gently on his arms. Vivian rested her hand on his chest. One by one, the rest of the family slowly circled around the bed. Greg reached for Emily's hand, and after a pause, she took it. Karen joined without hesitation. Even Howard stepped closer and placed a firm hand on his sister's shoulder. And then, in that bright white hospital room, with machines humming softly and light filtering through the blinds, Tolu began to pray. His voice was soft but sure. "God, thank you for the life of this man, David. Thank you for his kindness, for his courage, for the love he gave our sister Vivian, even when he knew the world might not accept him." His voice quivered. He asked for nothing, yet gave everything. Let him feel peace. Let him feel love. And let those who misunderstood him learn what it means to honor a good man. Vivian began to cry again quietly, but openly. Greg bowed his head. Emily closed her eyes. Even Howard blinked back tears. When the prayer ended, no one moved right away. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was sacred. David, still conscious but too weak to speak, opened his eyes slowly. His gaze met each of them one by one. His lips didn't move, but his eyes said what needed to be said. "Thank you. I see you. I forgive you." And as the moment settled, Vivian realized something powerful. David was being seen, truly seen. Not just as the man she loved, but as a man of worth. What none of them knew was that David had already made a final request, a personal wish he left with Vivian, sealed in an envelope. And it was time to open it. After the prayer, the atmosphere in the room remained calm. It felt like the storm had passed, not just the one in their hearts, but in the space between them. The family no longer stood on opposite sides of a hidden truth. David had bridged that gap with grace, humility, and love. Vivian sat silently beside him, her fingers intertwined with his, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered the envelope David had handed her just a few weeks before the hospital stay began. He had said nothing about it, only told her to open it when the time felt right. For days she kept it tucked in her handbag, not ready to face what it might hold. But now, with the family present and the weight of everything already laid bare, she knew it was time. Vivian reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope. The handwriting was David's clear, strong and gentle. On the front, it read simply, "My final request." She carefully broke the seal and opened the letter inside. As she began to read aloud, the entire room leaned in. "To my beloved Vivian, and to everyone here today, I know that when this is read I may no longer be able to speak, so I will let these words carry my heart. I don't want a big funeral. I don't want my name on a stone in a place no one visits. I want my memory to live in something that breathes, moves, and touches others. That's why my final wish is this: please build the youth center. Finish the dream we started. Not for me, but for the children who don't yet know they're loved. Let my name be a quiet part of that place, a bench, a plaque, a wall of books. Let me be remembered not for how I died, but for who I chose to be." Vivian paused, hand over her mouth, sobs silently shaking her shoulders. Greg reached out to steady her. Emily covered her face, wiping away tears she no longer cared to hide. Then the letter ended with one line, written in bold letters. "Tell them I lived a good life. Because I loved you. No one in the room remained unmoved. Even Howard looked away, his lips tightly pressed together. David's final request wasn't for comfort, for wealth, or even for recognition. It was for impact. For love to ripple beyond his years. And in that moment, every person in that room made a silent vow. They would not let his story die with him. The hospital room no longer felt like a place of sorrow, it felt like a sacred space. Every person present had seen a different version of David before entering that room, but now all those shallow judgments had been stripped away. They saw him clearly for the first time, a man who had loved deeply, spoken truthfully, and left behind more than just memories. He left purpose. Vivian folded the letter and pressed it to her heart. It didn't matter that she had spent years keeping David hidden. He had forgiven her. He had given her more love and patience than anyone before him. And now he had trusted her with his legacy. She looked up, her voice trembling as she spoke. I will build the youth center. I don't care how long it takes. I will finish what he started. Greg placed a firm hand on her shoulder. You won't do it alone. I'm with you. Emily nodded as well, her voice soft but sincere. Me too. I want to be part of this. Even Karen stepped forward. We'll use our networks. This will happen. Howard, who had remained silent for some time, finally spoke again. I'll make some calls. I have access to funding old friends who owe me favors. We'll name it after him. Quietly, respectfully. Vivian nodded with tears in her eyes. She turned back to David, who lay peacefully, his chest still rising and falling in slow rhythm. He had heard it. She was sure of it. And that was all that mattered. Then Tolu stepped up with a small photo frame in his hands. He carried this everywhere, he said. Inside was a photo of David and Vivian taken in Nigeria, the day they had danced barefoot after a sudden rainstorm. They were soaked, laughing, and carefree. Tolu placed the frame on the table beside David's bed. He said that moment was the beginning of forever. No one said a word. The truth of that sentence echoed in everyone's heart. David wasn't just a guest in their lives. He was family, a man who walked quietly but left footprints in places no one else ever reached. And though the end was near, a quiet miracle was happening. He had already begun changing the future, even before his eyes closed. The next morning the doctors were surprised. David had made it through the night again, barely, but still breathing. His vitals were weak, but stable. The nurse came in with a soft smile. He's hanging on longer than we expected, she whispered. Vivian nodded, her eyes hopeful yet afraid. That's just who he is, she said quietly. Around noon, David opened his eyes slowly and looked around the room. The family had taken turns resting, and Greg was now sitting by the window reading emails on his phone. Vivian leaned closer. You're awake, she smiled softly. David gave a faint smile. I want one last thing, he said slowly. Vivian leaned in. Anything? David pointed to the sunlight peeking through the blinds. Outside, just for a moment. Vivian hesitated but then nodded. She called the nurse, and after a short conversation with the attending doctor, arrangements were made. With the help of hospital staff, they gently transferred David into a wheelchair, wrapped in warm blankets. Vivian brought his scarf, the one she had bought for him during their first winter together. And so, for the first time in weeks, David was wheeled out onto the hospital rooftop garden, a private space with benches, plants, and a view of the city skyline. The air was crisp, the sun gentle. It was quiet, peaceful. Vivian sat beside him, holding his hand as they stared at the clouds. After a few minutes, Greg, Emily, Karen, and even Howard joined them. Chuka and Tolu came up too. They all stood in a loose circle, surrounding David in silence, no longer as strangers divided by culture or opinion, but as one family united by love. David looked around slowly. His voice was barely more than a whisper. This is enough. I just wanted to see the sky again, with all of you here. A tear rolled down Vivian's cheek. She bent forward and kissed his forehead. "You gave us everything," she whispered. "Now rest. You don't have to hold on for us anymore." David leaned back, eyes half closed, breathing slow and steady. And for the first time in a long time, he looked at peace. They didn't know it then, but that rooftop would be the last place he would ever smile. The rooftop air held a stillness none of them could explain. David sat in his wheelchair, bundled in layers, eyes closed but not asleep. The sun touched his skin gently, like a soft farewell. No alarms, no chaos, just peace. The entire family stood in a quiet circle around him. No one was on their phone. No one rushed to speak. It was as if time had slowed down just for him. Vivian sat on the bench beside him, her arm linked through his. She studied his face, memorizing every line, every shadow, every hint of peace in his expression. "You look like you're dreaming," she whispered. David didn't answer, but his lips curved slightly into a faint smile. After about 15 minutes, the nurse returned to wheel him back to his room. But Vivian noticed something strange. David hadn't opened his eyes since the rooftop. She gently touched his hand. "David?" she said softly. No response. The nurse moved quickly, feeling for his pulse. Her professional smile faded, replaced by a stillness that told Vivian everything. She glanced at the monitor clipped to David's finger, then looked at Vivian with gentle eyes. "He's gone," she whispered. Vivian froze. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The world around her seemed to blur. It didn't matter that she had known this day was coming, it didn't make the pain any easier. She placed her head on his shoulder, silent tears falling. The man who had loved her without expectation, who had fought against silence, prejudice and distance, was now at peace. Greg stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on her back. Emily turned away, wiping her face. Howard bowed his head, removing his cap. Even Karen covered her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. Chuka whispered a quiet prayer in Igbo. Tolu stood with hands clasped in front of him, his face heavy with grief. The nurse gave them space. No one rushed to leave. No one dared to break the moment. They sat with him, family, at last. Broken, but united. Strangers no longer. And as the sun set gently over the rooftop, they said goodbye to the man they had once misunderstood, but now deeply respected. He came quietly. He left quietly. But what he left behind would echo for generations. The next few days passed like a blur. Paperwork, arrangements, condolences, everything came crashing in like a wave. But through it all, Vivian moved with calm determination. She wasn't just planning a funeral. She was protecting a legacy. David had made it clear in his final letter, no fancy ceremony, no cold church filled with strangers, no speeches that meant nothing. Vivian sat at the dining table with Greg and Emily as she held her notepad close, scribbled notes in hand. He didn't want a performance, she reminded them. Greg nodded. So let's make it meaningful. Real. They decided against a large venue and instead chose a quiet memorial garden on the edge of town, a place surrounded by trees and silence. Just a handful of guests. No press, no pretense. Vivian personally selected every photo, every piece of music, every reading. She wanted it to feel like David, humble, thoughtful, full of love. As they discussed the guest list, Emily hesitated. "Should we invite anyone from his side back home?" Vivian nodded. Yes, his mother, his sisters, even if they can't come, they deserve to know. Greg pulled out his phone and offered to make the calls. Tolu helped with the arrangements, offering to speak with the Nigerian embassy for travel support. Chuka began gathering old photos and memories to include in a small booklet. Even Karen, who had been silent most of the week, brought over a tray of food and sat quietly, helping fold programs. Howard showed up later that evening. He didn't say much, but he handed Vivian a white envelope. Inside was a personal donation, a sizable one for the future youth centre. Vivian didn't ask how much. She simply nodded and whispered, "Thank you for believing in him." There was no drama, no debates, no sudden arguments. The family, once divided by secrecy and suspicion, now worked as one. And through every task, every plan, one thought stayed in Vivian's heart. David never wanted to be mourned. He wanted to be remembered. And when the day came to lay him to rest, she was ready to honor him not just as her husband, but as the man who changed them all. The morning of the memorial arrived with quiet skies and soft sunlight. Vivian stood by the window in a simple black dress, not flashy, not elegant, just modest and meaningful, just the way David would have wanted. She wore a pendant he had given her from a Lagos street market, nothing expensive but priceless to her. It still carried the scent of his cologne. The memorial garden was small and surrounded by oak trees that swayed gently in the wind. White chairs were neatly arranged in a half circle around a stone platform where David's framed photo stood, a soft image of him smiling, wearing his favorite grey sweater, the one Vivian had secretly loved on him the most. One by one, close friends and family began to arrive. Chuka and Tolu stood at the entrance, greeting guests and handing out small printed programs with David's favorite quote at the top. A life is not measured by wealth, but by the peace it leaves behind. Greg helped set up the small speaker system. Emily stood beside the memory table, adjusting flowers and lighting candles. Even Karen took her place quietly in the second row. Then, just before the service began, 2 women stepped forward, David's mother and his older sister, flown in from Nigeria. When Vivian saw them, she rushed to meet them with open arms. "Thank you," she whispered, holding David's mother tight. The older woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "You gave my son love. I saw it in his face on every video call." The service began with music, soft instrumental versions of songs David used to hum around the house. Then Chuka stepped forward to speak. David didn't want a funeral. He wanted a reminder, he said gently. A reminder that kindness still exists, that love still wins, and that no matter how quietly someone walks into your life, they can leave footsteps on your soul. Tears flowed freely throughout the garden. Vivian didn't speak that day. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. She sat by David's photo with hands folded and eyes closed, as if still holding his spirit beside her. When the time came to lay his ashes in the garden's memorial grove, each person dropped a white rose into the soil. No loud goodbyes, no rushed eulogies. Just love, just silence, just respect. David didn't leave with noise, but he left with power. And his story wasn't finished yet. A week after the memorial, Vivian sat alone in her home, no longer just quiet but hollow. The rooms felt larger without David's presence. His slippers still sat by the door. His toothbrush was still in the holder. It was the kind of grief that didn't scream, it just settled in the chest like an anchor. But Vivian knew she couldn't let it drown her. David had left her with a mission. And it was time to begin. She opened her laptop and created a document. The David Youth Center. Foundation Plan. With trembling hands and blurry vision, she wrote the first lines. In memory of the man who taught us that love is louder than hate and peace is stronger than pride. The next few days were a flurry of purpose. Greg handled the legal structure, calling in a lawyer friend to help register the nonprofit. Emily reached out to architects and design teams, even suggesting a blend of African and Western architectural features to honor David's roots. Karen, surprisingly, stepped up to manage the donation logistics and donor communications. Howard contacted his old network of military retirees and business leaders, many of whom pledged funds without hesitation once they heard the story. He did more with little than most of us did with plenty, one donor said. David's story was spreading. Vivian, though grieving, led everything with gentle fire. She shared his story on a private blog and through her charity network, never as a widow looking for sympathy, but as a woman honoring the man who gave her life a second chapter. People responded. Volunteers came forward, young people offered to help, even strangers wrote letters saying how much his story had touched them. David, the man once hidden from her world, was now being celebrated by it. And one evening, As Vivian sat under a warm lamp reviewing proposals, she felt it that soft, unexplainable presence. As if he were there, still sitting beside her, still proud. She whispered softly into the room. "It's happening, David. Your dream is breathing." He might be gone, but he had never been more alive. The day the groundbreaking ceremony for the David Youth Centre was announced, the atmosphere shifted once again in Vivian's life. This time it wasn't grief hanging in the air, it was legacy, real, visible and permanent. A large crowd gathered on the cleared land just outside the city, a mix of locals, donors, church leaders, youth advocates, and family. Flags were placed gently around the lot, and a temporary stage was built with a modest banner that read, "David's dream begins here." Vivian stood in the front row, wearing a long navy coat, her hands folded over a small program. She glanced around and was humbled by what she saw, dozens of volunteers, young men and women who had read David's story and wanted to be part of something that mattered. David's mother had returned from Nigeria for the ceremony, wearing a bright yellow wrapper, proudly holding a photo of her son against her chest. Chuka opened the event with a heartfelt speech. David was never after applause, he said. He was after impact. He didn't shout to be seen. He served to be remembered. And this place, this centre, will serve as a shelter of love, of growth, and of purpose for those who feel forgotten. Vivian stepped up next, and for the first time since his passing, she spoke publicly about her husband. "David taught me that love has nothing to do with background or borders. He taught me that true wealth is measured by the lives we touch, not the ones we impress." Tears filled the eyes of many in the audience. Howard stood at the back, arms folded, nodding slowly. Greg and Emily stood on either side of their mother, both holding back emotions they never thought they'd feel for the man they once questioned. At the end of the ceremony, Vivian walked to a black cloth-covered monument at the edge of the site. With trembling fingers, she pulled it away to reveal a stone plaque. It was simple but powerful. The David Youth Centre. In honour of the man who loved quietly, lived fully, and gave everything without asking in return. Let your legacy be your love. People clapped, but not out of duty. It was a soft, emotional applause, a salute to a man they all now knew by heart. Vivian stood silently in front of the stone for a few more minutes. She whispered, "Now they all know what I knew all along." And with that, the legacy of a once-hidden husband became something the world could never ignore again. That evening, after the groundbreaking, Vivian returned home alone. The house still echoed with David's absence, but tonight, it didn't feel like emptiness, it felt like he was still here, just in a different way. The light in the hallway was left on, the way he always did when she worked late. His slippers were still by the door, but now they no longer brought pain, they brought comfort. Vivian walked slowly to his study, the small space where David would sit with his laptop and soft music playing in the background. She opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. For weeks, she had been writing and rewriting a letter. Tonight, she would finish it. She sat down and began to write, no longer weeping, just remembering. "My dearest David. I waited to write this until I could do it without shaking, until I could do it without falling apart. You told me once that love was the only thing you could give me without limit. You kept that promise every single day. I'm sorry I hid you for so long, not because I was ashamed, but because I was afraid. You deserved better than my silence. But you never made me feel small. You gave me grace, even when I didn't deserve it. Now they know. All of them. They've seen your heart. They've heard your voice. They've read your words. And they are changed. Emily speaks of you with pride. Greg smiles when he hears your name. Howard, he asked if we could place one of your favourite quotes on the wall of the new centre. You were right, David. Love doesn't need a stage, it just needs truth. I'll keep telling your story. I'll keep showing the world the quiet strength of the man they almost never knew. Thank you for loving me when I was most unsure. Thank you for letting me love you until the very end. You were never a secret, David. You were my answered prayer. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a frame beside his photo. Then, she leaned back, breathing in the peace that now filled the room. Vivian had once feared what people would say if they found out about David. Now, she feared only one thing, that they'd never stop hearing about him. Because a love like his couldn't be forgotten. Weeks passed. The youth centre project was moving quickly. Construction had started, donations were pouring in, and David's story had quietly made its way into community articles, blogs, and even one national interview Vivian reluctantly agreed to do. But she never expected the person who showed up at her doorstep one rainy afternoon. Vivian opened the door to find a young black man in his early 20s, soaked from the rain, holding a folded newspaper to his chest. He looked nervous but determined. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you Mrs. Vivian Cole?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, can I help you?" He handed her the newspaper. It was folded open to the feature article titled, "He changed a family on his deathbed, now he's changing a community." David's face stared up at her with that familiar soft smile. The young man cleared his throat. "I read this story. I've read it 10 times now. I had to come." Vivian stepped aside and let him in. He stood in her hallway, dripping water, eyes full of something she recognized, pain and hope. "My name's Isaiah," he said. "I never knew my father. I grew up angry, in and out of trouble. But this article, this man, I don't know why, but it got to me. I want to help. I want to do something with my life. I don't want to waste it." Vivian felt her heart squeeze. He pulled a worn notebook from his bag. "I've started writing," he said. Like he did. Like David. "I want to volunteer at the centre. I want to speak to kids like me." Vivian stood frozen, overwhelmed. This wasn't a planned donor, a relative, or a media person. This was the kind of soul David had always reached without trying. She stepped forward and hugged him, not out of pity but out of pure understanding. "He would have loved you," she whispered. "And he would have believed in you." Isaiah nodded through quiet tears. And in that moment, Vivian knew. David's story wasn't just being remembered. It was multiplying. The David Youth Centre opened its doors 6 months later. It was more than a building. It was a heartbeat. A place painted in soft, earthy tones, with wide glass windows that welcomed sunlight and walls that whispered legacy. From the classrooms to the music room, from the community library to the mentorship pods. Every inch carried the quiet touch of a man who had once asked for no recognition, only purpose. On opening day, the community gathered like family. Children ran around, parents mingled, former donors visited, and media crews kept their distance out of respect. There were no VIP speeches, no long-winded ceremonies, just music, joy, and a moment of silence in honor of the man who made it all possible. But what caught everyone's breath the moment they walked into the main entrance was what sat on the center wall, a towering, simple wooden frame holding David's last words, carved beautifully into the grain. "Let me be remembered not for how I died, but for who I chose to be." People stopped to read it. Some stood silently. Others whispered to their children. That was the man who loved without asking for anything back. Vivian walked the halls slowly that morning, stopping to greet new volunteers and the young leaders being trained to serve. Isaiah, the boy who had shown up at her door, was now leading a writing workshop for teen boys. She watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes, as he held up his notebook and told them, "You don't have to be loud to change the world. You just have to be real." Later that afternoon, Vivian walked alone into the small reflection room she had built just for herself. A quiet space with one chair, a candle, and a photo of David. She lit the candle and sat. "We did it, David," she whispered, tears gently running down her cheeks. "They see you now. Not as the man I hid, but as the man who healed us all." She rested her head back, closed her eyes, and smiled. He was gone. But his love had taken root. And what had begun as a secret was now a sanctuary. It had been 1 full year since David passed. Vivian stood in the courtyard of the youth centre, surrounded by laughter, music and sunlight. The place was alive, not just functioning, but thriving. Dozens of young boys and girls played games, read books and participated in mentorship sessions. Staff moved around with purpose. Volunteers wore shirts with the simple logo, the David Way Love Quiet Gold. Vivian had grown into a new version of herself, still grieving, still missing him, but no longer weighed down by the guilt of the past. She no longer replayed the years she kept him hidden, because she had spent every day since revealing him to the world, and more importantly, revealing the kind of man he truly was. Inside the centre, one small room remained just as she'd designed it. It was the David Reflection Room, a quiet space where anyone could sit, think, cry, or simply breathe. On one wall hung framed photos from Nigeria: David laughing in the rain, David making a mala for her, David sitting cross-legged with local children in his hometown, telling stories with his hands. On another wall was a shelf full of journals and notes written by teens who had passed through the centre, each one scribbled with stories, dreams and thank yous. Vivian entered the room alone and sat in her usual spot beneath his photo. She pulled out her journal and wrote one last letter to him, not one of sorrow, not of regret, but of peace. Sir, _ my love, I no longer feel ashamed of the years you were hidden. I now see that even in secret you were shining, quietly healing me, quietly preparing me. I thought I brought you into my world, but it was you who gave me a world worth living in. And now your peace is everywhere. It's in the laughter of the boys you've inspired. It's in the wisdom of Isaiah's words. It's in the eyes of your mother, who now visits America with pride instead of pain. And it's in me, David. You left in silence, but you taught us all to speak love out loud. I will never stop telling them about you _ She closed the journal gently. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and somewhere nearby, a young boy laughed. Vivian smiled, stood, and whispered toward the heavens. Now you're no longer a secret, David. You're a seed. And look how beautifully you've grown. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you.